Okay, welcome everyone. Let's see if I can get this sound adjusted a little bit here. Thank you all for coming. I see some familiar faces, both from earlier generations and newer generations, and I'm really gratified to see such a nice turnout today. As president of both the Alaska chapter and the Northwest section of the Wildlife Society, it is my pleasure to introduce this seminar interview with Dr. Samuel J. Harbo, retired UAF professor in wildlife management and statistics. This interview is part of the Wildlife Society celebrating our wildlife conservation heritage, or COWCH, series, which chronicles the careers and experience of individuals that have had a significant impact on the wildlife profession. Many of you may remember Dr. Harbo from his tenure as professor at the university here for a period of 22 years before retiring in 1986. During that time, he served 10 years as chair of the UAF Department of Wildlife and Fisheries and was instrumental in establishing the UAF Statistics Department. He also served as chairman of the Board of Game for 7 of 10 years during the period 1975 to 1985, during a tempestuous period when subsistence and wolf control were hot-button issues. In addition, he collaborated with biologists at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game to develop and improve population estimation techniques for moose and other species. This interview will be conducted by Kathy Harms, retired fish and game biologist. This is an opportunity to hear about Dr. Harbo's experiences during his career here in Alaska, which spanned the time from the transition from territory to statehood, the rapid growth in human population due to the oil boom, the dramatic changes in land ownership associated with the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and the subsistence battle, the impacts of the Marine Mammal Act, and the wolf wars of the 1970s and 1980s. He will share with us his perspectives on the changes he has observed during his lifetime as they relate to wildlife conservation management in Alaska. This is an opportunity for a new generation of students and faculty to become acquainted with Dr. Harbo and his career, which spanned an important period of transition in Alaska. This is also an opportunity for the older guard, including myself, to reflect on his career and the influence he had on his students and peers. Dr. Harbo's background as a wildlife manager and consumptive user gave him valuable perspective as a teacher of wildlife management and as a decision maker. His master's degree studies and early tenure with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game gave him important insights into the challenges and cultures of native and rural people in many parts of the state. His background as a biometrician gave undergraduate and graduate students a solid background in statistics and scientific sampling. As an undergraduate in the wildlife management program here at UAF, I can attest to the influence Sam had on me through his mentoring and teaching. The best courses I took while at UAF were taught by him. One was a graduate seminar on current topics in wildlife management, and the other was his scientific sampling course. What made these courses so memorable was their applied nature. They had real relevance to what lie ahead for us as biologists and/or biometricians. Both of these courses were designed to get students to engage in topics, whether it was through face-to-face interaction with agency personnel to gain insights on current and controversial wildlife management topics, or to get out and conduct sampling exercises, whether sampling the campus student population or doing vegetation metrics. Real hands-on stuff. His mentoring both during my undergraduate career and his subsequent encouragement when I returned to Alaska in the mid-1980s to a tight job market after graduating from grad school in Montana still means the world to me. Before I turn the microphone over to Kathy and Sam, I would like to read a couple of brief notes of appreciation from his former students that couldn't be here today. The first is from Dr. Dana Thomas, Professor Emeritus of the Department of Mathematics and Statistics, and also a recent UAF Interim Chancellor and former chair of the Department of Mathematics and Statistics. Quote, "I took classes from Sam as an undergraduate. He was a great teacher. Those classes led to my graduate work in statistics and eventual career at UAF. Thus, Sam had a huge impact on my life, and I am grateful every day for that." The next is from Fish and Game biometrician Earl Becker. who has worked for the Department of Fish and Game since 1984 as a biometrician down in Anchorage. In a letter that he's written to Sam, I'll just give you some excerpts. He states, "I have the warmest memories of your scientific sampling class. It so inspired me. As you may recall, you wrote a letter of support for my acceptance into the master's degree statistics program at Oregon State University. I took many interesting classes and learned the skills to be a professional statistician at OSU. My coursework at OSU was very good, but there was no scientific sampling course, and nothing I experienced there would have inspired me to become a biometrician." For that, I am eternally grateful that you taught such an inspiring course and that I was lucky enough to take it. Mr. Becker goes on to detail the many interesting projects he has been involved in with Fish and Game. He closes by stating this: "The spark that ignited the flame came from a homework assignment in your scientific sampling course estimating the breast diameter of a stand of trees on the UAF campus. Your gift of that spark has never left me, and I am so grateful for it." I'm sure there are others in the audience with similar testimonials. However, we must proceed with the interview. With this introduction, I'm happy to hand the microphone over to Kathy Harms, who will now introduce Sam Harbo about his life and career. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm going to interrupt first. For a second there, I thought he was blaming me for getting into biometrics.
One quick clarification from Scott. We have 2 hours. We have to be done by 2 o'clock? 3 o'clock. Okay, that's one. Number two, I'm going to ask the audience, please turn off your cell phones. I do not want to be interrupted for this. And number three, Scott, if we are approaching 3 o'clock but there are questions from the audience, we can address those. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Well, I cannot tell you how honored I am to sit here. This is a terrific opportunity. I get to talk to these tremendous mentors, and this is my third one, and hopefully I'll get this right this time. Considering that number one and number two are both here in the audience, you can critique me later. Let's get started personally. At this point, if there's a question that I ask that you're not comfortable with, just say, hey, let's go on to another topic. If you want to expand on one of these, keep going and we'll try to keep up with you. But we'll start with personal information. Where were you born and when?
I can answer both of those.
Yay!
I was born in a small town in southern Minnesota. Actually, I was born on a small farm in southern Minnesota, and it was in 1929.
Wow. Were your parents directly involved in natural resources or statistics or something?
No, I was born on a very small farm in southern Minnesota, 80-acre farm. And let me set the background a little bit so you can understand where I'm coming from. I was the youngest of 9 children.
Wow.
When I was born in 1929, the years after that, some of them were fairly good, some of them were very bad economically. So you can imagine the situation we were in with 9 children.
Wow.
Going into the Depression on a very small farm. 80 acres even at that time was not a large farm. Mm-hmm. So essentially we were fairly stressed as far as money was concerned. We weren't poor. We were on a farm. And farmers at that time tended not to be poor in the sense that they were hurting for food and so forth. So we had plenty of that kind of sustenance. But we worked to survive, essentially. And when I say I was the youngest of 9, my oldest sibling was a boy, 20 years older than me. He was 20 when I was born. And from then on, it was just about every 2.5 years, there was another child born. So you can imagine how many mothers I had. I had 2 brothers and 6 sisters. So I had a considerable amount of supervision.
Did your other siblings go to college, or did you break a mold there?
The oldest sibling, the boy, didn't go to high school. The rest of the children did. And all of them, except my other brother, went further than high school. They would go to a teacher's college training or nurses training. One of them was a beautician. One of them was a secretary, so went to secretarial school. So all of them did. My folks really stressed education, because in many respects, if you stayed on a farm or on a ranch at that time, if you really wanted to make your mark in the world, you got off the farm, you got off the ranch. It was probably the wrong thing to do sociologically, but as far as making a mark in the world, you had to have an education. So there was a great deal of stress on education.
Where did you go to college?
Well, let me back up a little bit and kind of digress for a second, because my upbringing really conditioned my approach to life. Mm-hmm. 2 things that were important in my life. One was the age of my dad when I was born. He was 50 years old. So in retrospect, it really gave me an insight into how life was before I was born, because his experience extended back far enough that I could begin to kind of understand the situation that existed when he was growing up. But in addition to that, I got further insight into history, because his dad was 50 years old when I was born.
When he was born?
When he was born. He was 50 years old when he was born. So my grandfather was born 100 years before I was. It's kind of interesting. My grandfather was born in 1829. My dad was born in 1879, and I was born in 1929. So in talking with my dad, his memories extended back into the mid-1800s.
Wow.
So I was getting a secondhand account of what life was like in Minnesota, essentially before that area was developed. My grandfather came over to America when and actually homesteaded the farm in 1853. And they were the first settlers in that area. In fact, he came over with 2 brothers and a cousin. And they all settled in a very small area in southern Minnesota. And then subsequently, there were lots of Norwegians that also came over with the contacts that they had with their relatives and friends in Norway. So the whole community was Norwegian. But the thing is, since my relations, my father and his brothers and a first cousin were the first settlers there, when the rest of the Norwegians came in, they intermarried with my relatives. So all of a sudden, when I was growing up, I was confronted with the fact that I had cousins everywhere. I mean, there were people that I didn't even recognize the last name of. When I would go and talk with my parents, they said, that's a distant cousin. So what it was a very small community. So essentially my whole world was constrained. My horizons weren't stretched very far at that time. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, they were stretched back in time. So I really had an appreciation for that whole area as I was growing up. And I got an appreciation for what it was like before it was settled. What a wilderness really meant as far as people growing up were concerned. So that really tended to influence my approach on what I really thought would be desirable when I grew up and what I should do.
Where did you go to college?
I went to college at Lincoln, Nebraska. And kind of another story as to why it was there. When as I said, I was the youngest of 9 siblings, of 9 children, 8 siblings. Many of them had left home by the time I was old enough to experience any really relationship with them. So many of them were just adults. They were kind of strangers to me because they had moved away. But my mother got sick in about 1935 with breast cancer, and she died very shortly thereafter. In fact, she died when I was 9 years old. And then, by then, my oldest brother was away with his own family, and all the other siblings except my brother and 2 sisters, the next 3 oldest, were still there on the farm. But then my brother left in 39, graduated from high school in 38 or 37, and then went and was working on a neighboring farm. So it was just my dad, my 2 sisters, and I when my mother died. So all of a sudden, I when I was growing up, I was one of the bigger boys in my age class. So since my dad was 50 years older than I and the age was starting to wear on him, I had to do more and more of the farm work. And so by the time my other 2 sisters had graduated from high school and left, it was just my dad and I on the farm. And from my sophomore year on, it was just my dad and I that were on the farm. And since my dad was old enough that it was very difficult for him then to do all the farm work. So in my last 3 years of high school, when it was really when there was a lot of work that had to be done, particularly in the fall when we were harvesting corn and so forth, I would sometimes take a week off from high school and then go the next week and maybe take the next week off and go the next week. So that happened my last 3 years essentially in high school. But I can remember one morning, well, it was in my senior year in high school, early in the fall. It must have been in late September or so. My dad would always get up early in the morning and start the fire in the wood stove. And he would have that going well by 6 o'clock, and I'd get up and then we'd come down, we'd share a cup of coffee. And I came down this one morning, he had already gotten everything ready. It was still kind of chilly, so I had my cup of coffee and I was standing in front of the oven. And he said, "Sam, you're not, or Sammy," that was the name, Sammy, "you're not taking over the farm." I said, "What?" And he said, "You're not taking over the farm." He said, "You're going to school." Well, I don't know where there was any money for it, but fortunately there was about a couple weeks after that, there was a nationwide exam for students, for high school seniors that were interested in enrolling in a new Navy program. It was actually the offshoot of a V-12 program that the Navy had during World War II, where they would send men to and women to college to train them to be officers in the Navy. And that they decided they were dropping that, but they were going to start what they call the NROTC program, Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps program. So there was a nationwide exam on one Saturday morning. So I went down and took it, and I was fortunate enough to pass. And I was accepted then into the Navy program. And I had to list the college that I want to go to in order of preference, 5 of them. So I listed the University of Minnesota, the University of Wisconsin, the University of Michigan, the University of Iowa, and the University of Nebraska. Guess where I went to school? University of Nebraska. So in 1947, in fall of 47, I enrolled at the University of Nebraska.
Well, you only had, according to what you said, about half the high school you needed, so I guess that's where they put you, huh?
I had all the high school.
You skipped every other week, though.
I didn't, well.
It was a joke.
No, but let me explain it, because it's kind of interesting. I went to, when my grades 1 to 8 were in a 1-room schoolhouse. Then I went to a big school in the town of Hanska that had 125 people. And they had a fairly good-sized building. It was 3 floors. It had grades 1 through 12 in it. One building, about 100 feet square, 3 foot. So you can imagine, my high school class was one of the larger. It was about 12. No, it was exactly 12. 6 boys and 6 girls.
And how large was the university?
In that kind of an environment, everyone knew everyone else. So the teachers knew all the situations that prevailed around. Mm-hmm. And they realized the situation I was in. So they bent over backward to accommodate my needs. And I doubt if it would have happened in any other kind of school.
How large was the University of Nebraska when you got there?
It was large, 7,000 about.
That's a big change.
Small by this day. And that's another very interesting thing. I was probably the most naive person in the world when I went to the University of Nebraska. I really didn't know what was offered in any of the schools. You know, I had no idea what different curricula there were that you could major in. I had an uncle, however, that had a PhD in biochemistry. No, not biochemistry. In chemical engineering. And yeah, that's probably something to declare a major with. So I did. But you know, like I say, I didn't even know what the difference was between a sorority and a fraternity when I went to Nebraska. So I had a real steep learning curve that I had that I was faced with. So I went to Nebraska after one of my first courses that it was there convinced me that engineering wasn't what I wanted to do. So you know, I was very interested in nature and agriculture and so forth, and I did a lot of hunting when I was little, trapping because we had very little cash, and that was one way to get money. So I did a lot of cash, and I really enjoyed those kinds of activities. In addition to farming, I really enjoyed it. It was looking back on it, I consider I had a very happy boyhood, even though it was work, and a lot of responsibility, and not anyone. A bicycle would have been, oh my gosh, unbelievable. So none of the 9 kids had anything like. We didn't have the kind of cash to do the thing, but we really enjoyed the environment that we grew up in. It was a family structure and a community structure, so I really enjoyed it. But like I say, I realized quickly that engineering wasn't what I wanted to do. So I started looking around at the University of Nebraska, and I realized that my interests really were in agriculture, and I really enjoyed things like hunting and fishing, and was always interested in what it must have been like in Minnesota before it was settled. So I was interested in wildlife, in wilderness. And Alaska had always intrigued me because that was another odd happening in this 35 I didn't realize at the time, but back in 1935, there were people that came to Minnesota to try and interest farmers, established farmers, in going to Alaska to settle a development in Palmer. And they actually had approached my dad, and I didn't realize this until a few years ago when a sister of mine who's still living, she just turned 100 this past December. But she asked me if I knew that Dad had considered going to Alaska in 36 or 35 or 36. She wasn't quite sure which, and that was the first I'd heard of it. Wow. But actually, he had actually considered it at that time.
Wow. So when you realized you weren't going to become a chemical engineer, what did you choose for a major? What did you get your bachelor's degree in?
I finally decided the thing that interested me most of what was available there was soil conservation, agriculture, one of the programs in agriculture. So I actually got a degree in soil conservation.
What prompted you to go to graduate school?
Well, I realized that I didn't want to continue in agriculture, that I really had these other interests. And I started thinking about it, and I started realizing what was available. And I realized that, I really want to get into the wildlife area of some sort. And the more I thought about it, and then I read Leopold's Sand County Almanac and so forth, and then I really decided I really want to get into that area. And when I after I graduated from Nebraska, I went into the Navy. And one of the officers there was a faculty member at the University of California, but he was recalled because he was in the Naval Reserve. So he was one of the officers serving on the ship with me in the Korean conflict. And we were talking about different things, and I said, I really wanted to go on to school because I wasn't that interested in soil conservation and staying in that. I wanted to get more into the biology and the wildlife area. And he mentioned a program that they had at the University of California in Berkeley, that it wasn't a wildlife program, but it was a wildlife biology type program. And the more he talked about it, the more I looked into it, and I realized that one of the faculty members there was the son of the author of Sand County Almanac.
Really?
A. Starker Leopold, the son of Aldous Leopold. And so I decided when I got out of service, and I got out of service in California, that I would apply for that program at Berkeley. So I got accepted into the master's degree program there for wildlife biology. And that's when then I started really on my wildlife career.
Wow. So it sounds like one of the officers on the boat was a mentor. Did you develop a mentor relationship with A. Starker Leopold, or did you get to know him at all?
No, I did get to know him very well. And he's one of those that really influenced my really getting into wildlife management. And he probably was a very significant factor in my ending up in Alaska and doing what I am in Alaska. And he did it in kind of a backhanded way. I was ready to start my research work for my master's degree. And so I went in to talk with him. It was sometime in the fall semester of 55. And he said, before I could say anything, essentially, he said, Sam, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be going to New Zealand for 6 months. And when I get back from New Zealand, I'm going to Mexico City for a year to write a book on the wildlife of Mexico. This was my major prof, who was going to direct me in research. And I thought about it for a little while. And they said, would you please write a letter of reference for me to the University of Alaska Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit, because I said I want to transfer up there at the end of the semester. So I'm really thankful for him. He had a very significant influence in my going to Alaska and pursuing my career in wildlife management. The other one that really influenced me in really pursuing seriously wildlife management, I can partly attribute Starker made a contribution to that as well, because he assigned some significant readings for his course, and one of them was the research work done by Paul Arrington in Iowa and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And reading that really convinced me that yes, wildlife management really was the area I wanted to get into. Just cool. Because of the completeness of the studies, particularly the mink muskrat studies that Arrington did. It really stimulated me. Very so cool. Starker had a significant influence in my getting into wildlife management.
So you transferred up to the University of Alaska, and is that where you finished your master's or your doctorate, or both?
I finished my master's then at the University
here
of Alaska here, yes. And then that was still before statehood. So after getting my master's degree, then I went to work for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And my first task was to go out to Cold Bay, and my project was to work with the refuge manager, Bob Jones, and do some sea otter food habit survey work in the western Aleutians. So we went out there, and then I began to realize, I really don't have some of the tools I need for doing sampling work, and particularly for something like sea otter food habit study, where you're going to have to sample the bottom and so forth. Bob Jones was well equipped to be the collector of the data, because he was very experienced with undersea work. Mm-hmm. But I was also scheduled to take a bear biologist position at Kodiak because the bear biologist there was quitting. But this was right before the Alaska was forming a division of game. And so there was some indecision among the Fish and Wildlife Services as to how they should continue staffing their Kodiak position. So they kind of put the bear project on hold for a while as far as staffing it until they found out exactly what Fish and Game ideas were also as far as doing research work there. So I decided in the interim I would just go and I had an opportunity to switch over to the new division of game. So in January of '59, I joined the department as a biologist.
On Kodiak?
No, my first station was going down to Juneau, and we were there my wife and I were there for from January until early in April. And by then the decision was that that Fish and Game would establish a office in Nome, and that I was going to be the first biologist staffing it. So early in April, we went out there and opened the office in Nome. But before we left out there, we had made the decision that some of the first priority for work in Nome would be to try and monitor the walrus harvest, because the walrus population had declined fairly drastically. So my first research task there was going out to King Island, flying out to King Island and landing on the ice, and then staying there for the harvest. And then all the people on King Island summered in Nome, so they would load up their umiaks with all the stuff that they needed to go back to Nome, and we'd cross the 40 miles of open water and end up back in Nome. So Gail and I went out to King Island in early April and stayed there through the harvest, and then came back to Nome with the people when they were going back on the umiak. A tremendous experience. In fact, it's probably the most memorable part of my Fish and Game work ever. Yeah.
I can imagine. I want to continue with that, but let's take a half step backwards. When and where did you meet Gail?
I was a graduate student here, and Gail came up to university to enroll in a geology program. And so I met Gail up here at the university. In fact, in the Eielson building, there was a laboratory that some of the wildlife graduate students had little desks in the room right off the lab. And Gail was working for the herbarium. She was typing labels for the different plant collections there, and part of the plant collections were just around the corner right in the same lab. So that's where I met Gail.
So your first assignment in Nome, were you the equivalent of an area biologist or a research biologist, or what all?
I was just a biologist there. I don't remember what specific designation there was.
How many people were in the office?
Me.
Yeah. So you were the clerk and the research and the management and the supervisor.
Like I was just a biologist there.
Wow. So when did you and Gail get married? Before Nome?
Yes, we got married. We probably met it must have been about January in '58, and we got married May 1, '58. May Day. May Day has two contexts: really joyous, happy one, or
disaster.
We had the former.
Did you have children?
Yes, we have 4 children. Our oldest daughter, Lisa, is here. And then we have another daughter, Laura. She lives in Anchorage. We have a son, Keith. He's a electrical engineer working for Boeing in Everett, Washington. And we have a son, Sam Jantz, who got his medicine degree from WASU, Washington State University, then went on for postdoc work in animal pathology and is now with a lab in Columbus, Ohio.
How long did you stay in Nome?
Stayed in Nome until it was about 1.5 years. And I had collected the data, the walrus data in particular. And once I got it, I started analyzing it. And then I realized I really don't know how to analyze it. And that occurred in that big data collection I had made in 59, the first year that we were at King Island. Subsequently, I went also to Diomede for their spring harvest. So by then I had a lot of data, but I realized that I didn't know how to handle the first data set. And I thought, this is crazy. I'm collecting this data and I don't know how to analyze it. And I always had an interest in the math side of things. So I decided I got to go back and get some skills here to analyze the data. And the more I thought of it, I thought, well, if I'm going to go back to school, I might as well go back and see if I can get a doctorate in stat. So I started taking correspondence courses when we were at Nome. And I realized I really needed to get my calculus out of the way. So I took 3 calculus courses by correspondence from the University of California at Berkeley when I was at Nome. So I got some of that out of my way before I went back to school. But I decided I needed to go back to school. So I started looking at what stat programs were available, and I realized I wasn't interested in the math part of stat as much as I was in the applied. And I realized there were 2 schools that were really top-notch as far as applied stat was concerned. One of them was Iowa State University, and the other one was North Carolina State University. So I applied to both, and I got accepted to both. And they said, okay, which one am I going to go to? Iowa State was the first one that was established, and as it turned out, one of their leading statisticians there had moved to North Carolina State and established a program there, and very rapidly it was a rival of Iowa State. So it was a real mix. I first thought, well, it's going to be Iowa State, and then I realized in correspondence that North Carolina State had developed a wildlife consulting program in their stat department. They had made an arrangement with 11 southeastern states where they would provide the statisticians at the college, and then they would get different problems sent into them or do some teaching with the different wildlife management programs in those different states. And that was right in my house. So that's where we went.
And
it's kind of interesting. We left Nome in August and drove to North Carolina State. We had a beagle that was raised in Nome. And here, coming from Nome, living there for a while, getting to Raleigh, North Carolina in August with humidity practically 100, the temperatures. I remember we had rented a house on scene, and we got into the house, sat down. We had Lisa, our oldest daughter was with us. The dog was howling, very unhappy with the situation. We got inside, the house smelled moldy. Gail sat down on the sofa and cried. I felt like doing the same thing. I thought, what a mistake. As it turned out, it wasn't. We quickly got out of that house and found one that was located in a big stand of pine, longleaf pine. It was just an ideal little cabin, and life got better.
And how long were you in North Carolina?
We were there for, I guess it was 3 years. And then we came back to, I hadn't finished, we came back to the University of Alaska. I was accepted there. And so I joined the faculty and taught a year, and then took a leave of absence and went back to North Carolina State to finish up my coursework, because I had gotten some extra courses that were required. As I indicated, there was a wildlife consulting program that was in the department, and the program actually gave me a stipend, I think, of $275 a month for being essentially a teaching assistant with that wildlife program. But at the same time, the stat department at North Carolina State had gotten funds from the NIH to start a biomath program. And they were looking for PhD students to enroll in that biomath program. And they got a lot of pure math students, but they couldn't find any ones that were interested in the quantitative side that had a biology background. But then they saw me. And so they said, would you switch over? And instead of continuing with the wildlife consulting, switch over to the biomath. And I said, well, no. I said, I'm really satisfied. So I turned it down, but then they came back again. And they said, would you really reconsider? We can give you $600 a month tax-free. And I said, what else? And they said, well, it means that you're going to be taking some additional courses. And I was about to turn it down. I finally decided to switch over. But one of the additional courses that I didn't realize at the time was a chemistry program. I mean, a chemistry course that emphasized model building. And of course, model building was getting to be a real fad. And the biomath program was stressing model building. So I ended up having to take this additional chemistry course as well. And it's one of the harder chemistry courses. So all of those additional courses that I had to take required that I had to go back. And so that's why I took the extra year going back.
When you first started working for the state after your federal gig, and back in the federal days too, what did you look at as far as salary, benefits? What was being provided to you other than being the sole person in Nome?
Well, the salary wasn't good, wasn't particularly good. I can't remember what the initial one was. But the thing is, it was exciting. It was exciting doing that kind of work. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. You know, not many people get a chance to do something like going out to King Island and so forth. going out with the native hunters in their umiaks and seeing how they harvested walrus and so forth. So the thing is, it was so exciting. So the money wasn't bad, but it wasn't really the money that got me into wildlife management.
So you went back to North Carolina, you finished your doctorate.
Yes.
You came back and continued to work for the university?
Yes. I continued. I continued working for the university, but did consulting with, Fish and Game and Fish and Wildlife Service and other groups. So I kept my hand in the wildlife management part.
And you stayed with the university for 20 years after that?
Yes, I actually retired in 1955, not 56. I forgot.
When did you first get approached about serving on the Board of Game?
Oh gosh, it kind of came out of the blue. I was just asked if I would serve on the Board of Game, and there was no warning that I was going to be asked to serve on it. Mm-hmm. And it just occurred. I can't remember when exactly it was, but it was an opportunity I thought that I should take. So,
as you look over time, was there a basic change of the kinds of issues the board approached, or was it pretty much the same year after year?
Well, wildlife management was changing very rapidly in the state.
How?
I can remember it must have been in about 1960 some, that one of the problems the biologists were facing with the Nelchina caribou herd was in finding enough hunters to take as many caribou as the department thought should be harvested. That's not the case today. I mean, it just completely turned around. Mm-hmm. It wasn't excess hunters in some of these areas. We were trying to arrange essentially the seasons and bag limits and so forth so that it would encourage harvest in some of these areas. So that was changing. But the thing is, the whole complex of wildlife management was changing. And I think a lot of it was not just local, it was nationwide.
What were those changes?
I think one of the basic changes was we were changing from an agrarian society to a different one. Back in the 30s and 40s, when you start looking at the population of the United States, it was in agricultural areas. If it wasn't directly on the farm or on the ranch, it was on little towns associated with it. You didn't have the massive populations in the large urban centers. So the people growing up in those more rural areas had an understanding of harvesting, of going ahead and that the taking of something was not necessarily bad or would have an influence on a population that was detrimental. They realized that if you had a large cattle herd, that you had to do some harvesting of it, otherwise it would grow larger than it should. Mm-hmm. So there was a general understanding of that among the populace. As they became more urban, they tended to lose that understanding. And so you were seeing a shift in really what I considered population welfare, the welfare of a herd of animals, to more individual welfare of animals. And that made a significant difference in the way people tended to look at at consumptive use of wildlife. So there was that overall shift that was happening. And I think that eventually had a very profound effect on wildlife management. At the same time, the environmental issues were coming, and we got this thought of the balance of nature. It was almost a fad that started developing. And you could see, I could see it at the University of California at Berkeley when I was there. I can remember, as a good example, as I said, A. Starker Leopold was heading the wildlife biology program. And I can remember him using some of the examples, research examples that he had, either his students had done or he had done it with his students and so forth. Well, one of them was a Gamble's quail project, very close to campus. And really the conclusion of the project was that the thing that really controlled the bobwhite or the Gamble quail population was the combination of food and cover. And when he was explaining all of that, he said that during the summer, when there were very few raptors and so forth in existence, the quail could go a long way from cover for their food supply, that they could use a much larger area for their food resource. But that when the raptors came, they couldn't leave the cover as far away as they were used to. So it actually decreased their food supply. So the limiting factor on those were the cover food complex. You know, kind of mimicking what Arrington had found in mink muskrat. That it was a combination of some habitat factors that were controlling the muskrat population, that there was a bottleneck sometime in the season that controlled the size of the prey population. And so it wasn't the predation on it, but it was this other thing. So he used that as an example. But then a couple weeks after he had gone through that particular kind of example, he talked about the research that he had done on the couple of deer populations in the Sierras, and that they were experiencing large die-offs in some couple of severe winters. And it was because they had to yard up and there just wasn't adequate food supply. And he implied that if we hadn't reduced the predator populations, it would have reduced the deer populations enough so that they would be consistent with. But then about in the next breath, he said, you know, there are no studies that show that predators control prey populations. So I went back and said, how come when you talked about this Gamble quail population, you said it was the cover food that constrained the population, but you said that when all the raptors returned from where they were nesting in the north and came down, that no longer could the quail. And I said, why is it that and not predation that's causing it? And he said, well, I may have overstated that statement on predation. But you could see in the background was this idea of the balance of nature that was kind of controlling everything. So it really had an impact on the way we then had to look at wildlife regulation in particular.
And you saw that shift happening in Alaska as well.
Oh yes, it was everywhere, absolutely.
Yeah. When you talk about your Board of Game tenure, was there any you had to face a lot of issues, difference of subjects. Were you on the board when the Marine Mammal Protection Act passed?
I don't think I was on the board then.
But you had to deal with the aftermath of, you just stopped managing marine mammals from the state's perspective?
Yeah, I think that had been passed. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
But in terms of the shifts of demands on regulations and so forth, were there any particular issues you found more challenging than others, or was it the combination? What was the intriguing part about serving on the Board of Game?
Well, we quickly got into wolf control issues, and that probably took up most of our time. But then we also got into the new subsistence law that was passed. So we had a mixture of two areas that were very contentious: the wolf management issue and the subsistence allocation issue. And on the wolf management one, almost all the biologists, I think, back in the 50s that were entering wildlife management felt that, well, they had kind of accepted Arrington's views on predator-prey relationships, that predators really didn't have much of an influence on prey populations, that most of the predation was compensatory mortality rather than additive mortality, even though Arrington went out of his way to point out, don't use these findings and extrapolate them to ungulate prey population or ungulate predator relationships, because I don't know if they hold. He was very explicit about that. But most of us didn't want to believe that it didn't, because if it did apply, it made management much easier. Much easier. We didn't have to worry then about predator-prey relationships. So almost all the biologists, I think, were convinced that, yeah, we can extrapolate from Eric's and stuff, and it won't hurt us. I think I started questioning it in A. Starker Leopold's class, and so I was really wondering when I came up here if it really did hold. I wanted it to, because it made life so much easier. But it was very obvious by the time I joined the Board of Game that it wasn't about to happen. And I think after the very first meeting of the Board of Game, the board had decided that we needed to do wolf control. And it was the first time that the state was going to enter into wolf control. After almost all the biologists that were there had, the first biologists with the Fish and Game, with the Game Division, were anti-predator control that the Fish and Wildlife Service had been doing in the state. They were very anti, and they worked to get rid of that predator control, and all of a sudden now we were on the other side. We felt we needed to do predator control. So that first meeting, and for me, unfortunately, I went into that first meeting of the Board and Game, and the first thing I heard was, I nominate Sam Harbo to be chairman of the board. Here we had all these experienced people that had worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service, older than me. They had all this experience. Some of them had been members of the previous joint board that was the Board of Game and Fisheries, and then they split the Game Board out, and this was the first meeting of the Game Board. And I thought, oh my God. And before I had a chance to object, I was chair.
And how long were you chair?
I think I was chair for about 7 years, and I decided, no way, it's time. It's not good when someone is chair of the same thing for a long period of time. You really do need to change. And I finally talked someone else into, I finally talked enough of the board into not to getting someone else as chair.
I know early in my career, we had a change in governors, and the governor, of course, appoints the Board of Game. And I believe it was Governor Sheffield that came in and uniformly requested resignations from every member of the Board of Game. And 6 of the 7 board members tendered their resignation, and you didn't. What went through your mind, and why did that decision come about?
The reason I didn't resign was we had one experienced board member who had health problems, Sidney Huntington. And he had major heart operation that he was facing. And it was questionable whether he could stay on the board. And there was there were 2 other experienced board members that terms were up, were going to leave anyway. And I decided, my gosh, we need some continuity on the game board. And there was a provision in the Alaska statutes in the fish and game part that said a board member could only be fired for cause. Well, there was another more recent one in another section of Alaska statutes that no one ever really read that had changed that. But I decided I'm going to stick with the one that's more specific. And so I sent a letter to the governor indicating why I wasn't going to resign and why I wasn't going to resign. And I pointed out to him, I think, that my concerns for fish and game don't wax and wane with changing administrations and so forth.
You were probably his favorite person at that point.
There were 2 of us that were not his favorites. One was Ron Somerville and the other was Sam Harbo.
When you think of the profession of wildlife management in general and the different roles people can serve in, everything from a field biologist to a supervisor to a university professor, all of whom affect that field, what do you think is important to know or to feel, or what makes a good participant in wildlife management?
I think first off, they have to be very enthusiastic about the resource. And I think they have to place high value on it. And furthermore, I think they need to go ahead and recognize any of the particular biases that they may have, because they're dealing with a resource that is very important in its own right, that has probably a very meaningful place in the ecosystem. So they've got to look at the value in that perspective and appreciate its importance in that regard. And they have to realize that individuals, that people have a very wide spectrum as to what the maximum utilization or benefit from that particular resource should be. So they have to have a kind of an understanding of all of that and realize that their particular biases and perspectives have to be conditioned on that overall perspective. I think that's critical. Also, they need some smarts.
Hopefully we can stay within that in the future. When you think of the tools you had for wildlife management back in the day versus today, not only gizmos like radio collars or whatever, or ways to analyze material. What do you think are among the most important tools that have been developed?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer.
Maybe too broad.
It is. It is very.
Well, let me rephrase it. What do you think some of the most important developments within wildlife management have been? Whether it's from ways of data gathering to application to communication, what have been changes for the better that you've witnessed?
I think one of the things is the fact that we are better appreciating the interaction, that the interconnectedness that all of these resources have with the other resources. And I also think that we have gradually recognized the importance of the different values that people place on the resources. For a long time, management, I think many of the managers were very conscious of the individuals that placed a high value on direct consumptive use of the resources and not so much value on just the other values that some other people really placed importance on. So I think we tended to manage strictly for the hunter or the fisher, and not nearly as much for some of the other uses. I think that's changed dramatically. Yeah, I think it was largely ignored for a long period of time. Some of the others, I think we've got a much better understanding of population dynamics in general, and I think we have a better means of measuring some of those indicators of population change, and also of estimating abundance. That some of that has changed dramatically. I'm sure there are some that I've just slipped my mind at the moment, but those are some of the important ones.
You mentioned that predator control, or wolf control in particular, was a big issue. About 3 days ago in the Newsminer, 25 years ago today, the Wolf Summit. I thought of you, Sam. The paper that you presented at the Wolf Summit, I think, was one of the most enlightening I had ever seen. And can you mention what it was and how you came to it? Well, while you're composing your thoughts, let me explain. The Wolf Summit was a reactive thing scheduled under the Hickel administration, was it? I think?
Yes.
And it was in reaction to a wolf planning effort that had been moving along together, and it was starting to come apart. And they thought, we'll solve everybody's problem in about 3 days by inviting anybody who ever had an opinion about wolf ever to Fairbanks to talk it out. It was a very active, very media heavy, very protest heavy, very lots of loud screaming 3 days where I don't believe anything got worked out. But there were some very interesting papers presented, and I think yours was at the high end of the list. So with that background of what the Wolf Summit was, what did you tell people and why?
Okay, one of the things that had concerned me for a long time was the thought that it was environmentally wise to, let me rephrase it, it was an environmental victory if you could stop the consumptive use of a resource. That seemed to be almost a given in many people's minds. So if you could stop the harvest of moose, there must be a benefit there. I can remember at one of my first wildlife seminars, or at a wildlife, that wasn't one of my first ones, a wildlife seminar. It was in the beginning, the first class in September. I posed the question I posed the observation to the class. I said there was one action taken this summer that I think was a real environmental disaster. I was really going ahead and stretching the point. And I said, I bet you can't guess what it was. And no one volunteered anything. And I said, it was the complete ban on commercial whaling. Well, that got the attention of the class. And I explained why. I said there were many of those whale populations that desperately needed complete protection. There were other whale populations that were very healthy and they could sustain harvest. And I said, the complete cutting off of that resource meant that almost invariably the lack of those resources was going to be compensated for by additional use of non-renewable resources. And I said, that's no victory. That's not an environmental victory. But the thing, and I said, the reason this is dangerous is that it just cements in the minds of people the fact that if you cut consumptive use of a wildlife resource, you've done something that is environmentally enhancing. And I said, that's a terrible thing to do, because renewable resources, probably chances are it's much better than using a petroleum resource to substitute for it. So when we got into this wolf seminar, I developed a little paper looking at the environmental cost of, the cost of food production, and in general how far you had to send a morsel of food to Alaska, what it took to send it, the fact that it would use, non-renewable resources, the fact that much of those parcels of food were energy dependent, and I use statistics on farming where a third of the petroleum use on the farm was not on powering machinery, but it was on such things as pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizer. Almost all of it was petroleum based. And you didn't do any farming at that time without using herbicides, pesticides, and commercial fertilizers. All of it petroleum based. So then I compared it with a food resource taken from moose in the Unit 28. And the fact that almost all of that energy into that particular system came eventually from solar energy. It would be used by the plants, and then the moose would use the plant. So you cut out essentially that tremendous aspect of petroleum consumption in there. So that I was using that then as an environmental argument for wolf control on the moose population. And it's a very valid one, a very valid one.
I remember specifically speaking to someone who had told me, we don't want you to kill wolves because it's bad for the planet. And I showed them your paper, and they said, we don't want you to kill wolves. It eliminated the other argument, but it didn't change their opinion, and that was an enlightenment to me, but based on your paper. Of all of the things you've dealt with, what do you think the high point of your career so far has been?
The high point of my career was Gail and I going out to King Island.
That was early.
That had to be.
Hard to compete.
The other high point, and it was mentioned in the introduction, was my scientific sampling course. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but I had started a week-long sampling course strictly for practicing professional wildlife biologists and fishery managers. And I would hold it in usually the week after Thanksgiving in Anchorage, because the family would go down to Anchorage over Thanksgiving so the kids could swim at the Holiday Inn. So then I would stretch it out and have a week-long course in Anchorage. But I also held it, I think, in Juneau and Petersburg. But the thing is, I really thoroughly enjoyed that because it was so interesting to see people, some of the individuals that had experience in the field, all of a sudden realize that hey, there's a little different angle to some of this stuff. It was fun.
What do you think the effect your career has had on your family?
Well, it's kind of interesting. We did a lot of interesting things early on when I decided to go back to North Carolina State. We would always drive up here in the summer. I still had commitments to work for Fish and Game because I still had some projects that I was finishing that I had started at Nome. So we always came up every summer and then drove back out. So that kind of put a different spin on the we were nomads almost for a while. So that was interesting. That I think the children really enjoyed the out of doors and the fact that I had a direct professional attachment with the wildlife resources. None of the children went into the field of wildlife management. You know, one engineer and the other animal pathologist, but none of them directly in the field. But that's not surprising. I look at the children of some of the fellow faculty members, and many of them didn't even go to college. You know, it's kind of interesting how the offspring sometimes are quite different from the parents.
What do you see as the future of wildlife management?
I don't know what is going to happen. I think we're going to be less consumptive as far as direct consumption of wildlife. I think we're going to continue on this concern about individual welfare. You know, just concern. That seemed to be now also the attitude that individuals have for each other. It's almost a self-awareness of yourself. Maybe just because you're looking at this smartphone all the time and texting on it, not paying attention. But it seems to be accentuating in the population. I have no idea what that's eventually going to mean as far as wildlife management, but I see traits of that. And I think there's less and less of a tie to the land. And I think that's going to have. You can see it in agriculture. You know, when you look at how agriculture has changed, many of the farmers now really have no idea of many of the things that previous farmers had to know in terms of the relationship to the land. I can remember when I was growing up, my dad was saying we really need to get more fertilizer into this particular area, and he could tell it for whatever reason, I don't know. But now, the big farmers that might have 3,000 or 4,000 acres that they're farming of corn and soybean and so forth, they really have no idea. They have machines now that pick up how much fertilizer, machines that determine the amount of fertilizer that should be dumped in this particular area. They have directives that come out and say you shouldn't plant before this date. It's just completely changed. They no longer need the knowledge that the farmers used to have, because now it's done for them. I mean, it's just a completely different world as far as the really hands-on knowledge that they used to have, which means that you really knew the resource. For example, it used to be that with small beef herds or dairy herds, the farmer knew each animal individually. He could see, well, gee, this one doesn't look quite well. When you've got a dairy herd of 12 animals, you can tell. When you've got a dairy herd of 5,000, it's hard. And 5,000 now is a small one in parts of the U.S. Now you're getting up into 10, 15,000. So that kind of knowledge, that hands-on knowledge, isn't there anymore. And that probably is going to have implications in terms of our handling of our wildlife resources and our utilization.
What advice would you give a student of wildlife management these days?
If you enjoy it, continue with it. I think if you're looking at being I used quite a few years ago when I was teaching, there was the real lack of openings in the wildlife management field, and I felt it incumbent on me to tell them that. And I said, the good ones in your class are probably going to find a job in the profession. The rest of you aren't. That still holds. It's probably even more so now. But the profession itself has changed. But I think it's imperative that we get individuals who are truly interested in the field, persisting in it. And you need to be broadly trained. We used to just kind of train individuals in just a particular area of wildlife management. I think you have to be fairly broad in that respect and get the specific knowledge on the job. I think that's the only way you're going to get into the profession. And I think the profession kind of demands it.
Do you have anything else you want to say about high, low, wonderful points, funny things, scary things about your career?
No. There's one additional thing I think I want to tell anyone getting into any one of the fields, and that has to do with modeling. It's the buzzword in just about every discipline, modeling. There are really two aspects for modeling. There are two goals for it. One really is or two uses for modeling, let me put it that way. One use is as a predictor, a predictive model. And we tend to, in many cases, emphasize that. But the main value, I think, particularly in any of the resource areas, is not the predictive value, but the the underrated one, the analytic value of modeling. You go ahead and think you know what the interactions are in a particular system. So you go ahead and characterize that mathematically or however. And then you go ahead and see how it can predict whether it's accurate or not. If it isn't, you go back in there and look and see where it may have gone wrong. That's the analytic part. That's what gives you insight into the system. And that's the part of modeling that we're just ignoring. We're not using it the way it should be. For many of the resource areas, that's the only current real use that we should have for it. That's one of the things I think that's wrong with our preoccupation with human-caused global warming. We're looking at the models and looking solely in terms of, mostly in terms of its predictive value, and placing great importance on that, as though that's enlightening us. Whereas what we should be doing is we realize that the predictions are not very good, which indicates that either the models are incomplete, or they're in error, or they're incomplete and in error. We know one of those three is going to be there. But we're not doing that. Our discussion is on the prediction. We should be looking at the internal workings of those models, because that's where we're going to get the insight into the system. We're not doing that, and unfortunately many of the professionals are standing in the way of it because there's so much money involved in some of these modeling efforts now that you get possessive. You don't want anyone else looking at it. So you don't know what the internal workings are. So you can't go ahead and use it as an analytic model. Since that tends to be a fad now, that's one thing I would just warn everyone on, or caution everyone, that there's a real value in using them as an analytic tool and not a predictive one. And we need to really, I think, concentrate on that.
Very much so. Questions from the audience can be considered at any time. Randy.
Sam, I've heard you express the opinion that there's great value in university wildlife faculty having experience with a wildlife management agency before they enter the faculty position. Can you elaborate on that?
I would even expand on that, and I would say that I think it's important that any faculty member have experience outside academia before they continue all the way through on. And I think it's also very important for it's useful for students to somewhere have real life experience before they get into the profession and just concentrate in it. It's very broadening when you see something other than through the eyes of academia, which is what you're doing when you're a student, because there's so much more there. Yeah, no, I think it's extremely important.
Any other questions? Randy, follow up.
Many of us think of you as one of our heroes in the wildlife field for all of the things that you've done that we've heard about for the last hours. Can you name one or two or three people that you would consider your heroes, people that you thought made great strides?
Yeah, I think, let me just stay on the Alaskan scene for the moment.
Right.
The Department of Fish and Game, the game division, was really, really lucky to get the core group of people that it did when it formed. People like Bob Roush, Somerville, Al Erickson, Jim Brooks, you know, people like that. They were just extremely important. And there are many more others, but it's those kinds of people that I think really set the stage for working left. Ron Somerville, I mentioned Ron Somerville. I can't think of his name right at the moment. But anyhow, those are some of those, I think, they're extremely important for Alaska. And I'm looking at really the start of the game division. There have been others that have made significant contributions, you know, looking at it from the game board perspective. You know, people like Sidney Huntington, you know, just a valuable member for the complete perspective he had of views, and also a hands-on knowledge of the resources that he helped manage. I'm sure I've missed some very important ones, but those are some of those that I think of. Bob Roush is kind of interesting because I was impressed with Bob in another context. When Bob was a graduate student here, he started out on a mink research project out on the North Fork of the Hooslia. And then there was a moose project that came up through the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit, where both he and I were graduate students, that involved trying to monitor and assess the railroad kill of moose, you know, how they could prevent it and the extent of it and so forth. So Bob got very interested in that and decided he wanted to switch over. So I was going to take over the mink project that he had started. So he and I went out that summer, and he showed me the mink project that he had started out on the North Fork of the Hooslia. When we were there, we were talking about it. And he was a Marine in the Korean conflict, and I was on a ship on a destroyer off the North Korean coast, and we were talking about it about the same time. And he said he was a spotter for from a small island in a bay in North Korea. And I said, what was the name of the bay? And he said, Wonsan Harbor. And I said, well, we stayed in Wonsan Harbor. And I said, I was in the Combat Information Center a lot of the times when I had control of the center, when we were directing shelling to try and disrupt some of the North Korean traffic that was going right along. It was very mountainous there. There was a road right along the shore. And we would try and shell it and disrupt the traffic. And we had Marine spotters, and he was one of them. Life's small. World's small.
Dick.
Sam, you mentioned some of the challenges you had on the Board of Game, and one of them that I thought really must have been challenging. I remember the context and the troubles they gave the Game Board was the conflict between the federal ANILCA rural subsistence priority and the Constitution of Alaska, which makes that unacceptable under the Constitution. You can't discriminate on the basis of first of all, native, but also rural. But the Board of Game got handed the job of trying to reconcile the two sides of that conflict. I don't know if you have any comments about the nature of your deliberations, the board's deliberations then, and the degree of stress that it caused for the board. I mention that because I remember Sidney Huntington saying that he couldn't even sleep at night.
That what?
That puzzle.
That Sidney couldn't sleep at night because of the challenges of that. Scott, does the audience get onto the tape, or do I need to repeat the question? I think what Dick's asking is your perception of the challenges the board faced to try to reconcile the state definition of subsistence and the federal definition of subsistence, and how you worked around that. Is that basically the...
Well, we never worked around it. We never solved it. And that was I feel one of my real the failures I feel that I had. One of the difficulties we had was the ambiguity of the basic law. You know, customary and traditional use, essentially, is what it said. And many of people in their mind thought it was someone living out in the bush who existed solely because of, or existed solely on, the resources that were right there. And that's what his life was devoted to. And that's really not the way customary and traditional was defined or interpreted. And so one of the main problems I thought we had was trying to really define that in a way that everyone could agree. And I think most people really thought there was an element of need there that was the primary dictator of whether or not you had a subsistence lifestyle. But we could never get down to that. And the board tried. We were rebuffed at every time we tried to come down to a definition based on that. And finally we just ended up with something like rural. And it didn't solve the problem at all. It still doesn't. The problem is still there. You know, it pointed out a number of times that there are two mistakes that two mistakes that we can make when we do a determination of who gets it and who doesn't. One of them is we give the subsistence priority to someone who really doesn't deserve it, however it is, or should have it, however we define it. And the other one is to deny it to someone who really does deserve it. And if you look at it on the terms of need, the mistake you make in not giving it to someone who really needs it is a really serious one. But we tended not to go ahead and really consider that very much. It was also making sure we give it to someone who deserves it. And it was a minor, you know, there wasn't no problem giving it to someone who didn't deserve it. But we never really concentrated on the other one. And that error, I thought, was by far the most important. I thought it's much better for society if you can keep people in close contact with the land and their understanding of their relationship to the land and nature than to go ahead and essentially minimize that. I thought we were doing this thing backwards. Well, we never resolved that at all. So we've still got what I consider is a very unsuccessful attempt at trying to handle the subsistence problem. We haven't done it justice, is what I'm saying, because we have not defined it the way it should be. I think, and my upbringing is based on these. You know, I went sheep hunting once. I got a sheep. It didn't particularly thrill me. And I realized that I'm strictly a meat hunter. My upbringing is such that I thoroughly enjoy going out hunting. in seeing the animal and getting it. And it's extremely satisfying if it's something that I use. There was so much trophy emphasis on sheep hunting that when I got the sheep, I couldn't get it out of my mind that it was a trophy that I got and not the meat. So I didn't get the satisfaction. I'm a prisoner of my upbringing, is what I am. And that's why I think it's so terrible that we make the mistake of not giving subsistence. From my point of view, it's a need-based one. Not giving it priority to someone who is really a subsistence user. I think that's a real mistake. It's something we should try and minimize. But that's not going to solve the subsistence issue as we have it in public. The public issue, the partisan argument really that we have over subsistence today.
We've got one question here, and then we'll go to Knut.
Thank you for your time, and I love that you mentioned Paul Arrington so much because his work is just great to read. And one of the things that I've noticed in reading his work is that he had such an intimate connection with the systems in which he was working. And I have the perception now that a lot of graduate students and faculty members and other wildlife researchers have essentially less time to spend in their systems, like understanding them the way that he did. And I guess to me, it doesn't matter whether you're studying whales or caribou or porcupine or beaver or whatever, that connection helps develop ecological understanding. And I was just wondering if you could comment on whether you feel like researchers are losing that sort of naturalist perspective when doing ecological or wildlife management research.
So the question is, without developing a real strong connection between what they're studying, some researchers are lacking that connection and how that affects their perceptions and their abilities or their studies.
It's changing over time.
It's changing over time. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that it is changing over time, that we are becoming specialists to the degree that we lose sight of the bigger picture. I think it really is important that you do have a broader perspective. That doesn't say that you shouldn't do the very specific, very particular research that's just really looking at one aspect. But the thing is, I think in the training, you need the broader aspect. Yeah, I really do. Yeah, you should have eyes that see everything, not just what you're looking at. And unfortunately, we're tending to be zeroed in on just one thing.
Knut.
Well, that was exactly the topic I wanted to ask you about, because I noticed with some dismay that I'm the only faculty member from the biology department that is still around in this room. And I'm not even a wildlife biologist. I'm an ecologist and wildlife biologist. But I do think that your discussion about where you grew up, you and Paul Arrington were running around in the woods harvesting muskrats and foxes and shooting at birds and birdy critters as youngsters, and how that understanding of ecological, understanding about animals and plants and animals, as well as something about ecological relationships, fostered and promoted your interest in learning more about it at a different level. But I was curious along those lines and how when you grew up in more largely agrarian society and now more urban, that indeed kids are not, we talk about how kids have nature deficit disorder. They don't get out and do things. They are, they don't pick up food off the floor, and the consequences thereof is that their immune system is lousy compared to you guys that are running around the barnyard and have much better immune systems. But also just your knowledge. And I was curious, in our wildlife program as well as here in biology, we have one course for non-majors called Natural History of Alaska, and it's not deemed to be worthwhile for our majors to take that. Well, I bet you if I administered any test that I give to these non-scientist students, half you're going to flunk it. But so I'm curious, what sort of remedy do you see as for the next generation of wildlife managers when they don't really have that sort of background that you have? They have to learn this natural history stuff kind of on the fly. And if there is anything that we should think about as a biology department that also has a wildlife program, where we'll try to foster the acquisition of this kind of these kinds of natural history knowledge that I would see will be nothing but a benefit to somebody going in to deal with complex issues. And what is, so I just want to see what your opinion was on how we might foster and get back to providing this kind of information and education and knowledge to our new wildlife professionals.
So I believe the question is, since we have gone from the agrarian society to a more urban one, new people entering the field don't have the background that you had. And what could a university do to help those students gain that wisdom along with their other studies?
That's a very difficult one to answer.
Well,
You know-
I'm asking you.
I don't know how you can recapture something like that. I really don't. You know, we have field trips for kids in urban America, going out to rural America, going out to national parks. Something like that recaptures part of it, but not the basic element of the relationship to the resource. That's almost a consentive relationship that you have to experience in many contexts. And I don't know how you can recapture that very easily. There must be ways that you can give some insight into it. There must be. I just haven't thought of that aspect. How do you recapture that in a curriculum in particular?
Well, I remember perhaps 30 years ago, I walked into a room full of learned professors in biology and wildlife, and I had a little bone with me. It's one of those pin bones, you know, you get up a loose leg, really back scratchers and letter openers. And I asked them, these professors, I'm just an anthropologist or something. I asked them, what is this stuff? Not one of them knew it. From which I had to deduce, you guys don't get out in the woods too much, do you? And you certainly are not cutting off mooses at the rate that you should be. Those basic stuff. And I bet you I've had to ask Dave Klein or Dale Guthrie about it. They'll just laugh at me. Of course you know what that is. But all these other folks, but really? Next I'll show you a wolf, but we can't identify it. What the heck?
We're going to go to Randy, then Mary, then Dick.
Sam, let's go way back to the beginning of your presentation here today. You mentioned a cool morning in the kitchen with your father in your junior year of high school, and he told you you're not going to take over the farm. To me, that shows a great insight and thoughtfulness on his part. Is that the way you interpreted it, and was that typical of him?
Kind of. I think part of his comment was, frankly, a kind of a selfish one. Let me explain. When he was growing up, there wasn't any high school in the whole close area. And he went away to what my sisters told me. He never told me this, but my sisters told me he went away to normal college. And he was there for a little over a year, but TB was so bad that many of his siblings had died, so his parents called him back. And so he never finished school. Well, I thought at first that it was probably college, as we know it. But no, I think it was high school. And because normal college, at that time, normal college was a teacher's college that also had a high school. And I think it was in Mankato, which was about 25 miles away from the home. And I think that's probably was the closest high school at the time. So I think he was probably going to high school after he had gone through the first 8 grades. And he was called back from that. But I think he always had a real yearning for going on to college. And I think I was his hope. So that's why I say I think it was kind of selfish in that regard. But as I said, I had 2 brothers, and the one brother who just a little less than 9 years older than me had been in service out in California when the war was over. He stayed out there and was working there, and he had finished high school, had not gone on to school. So I think Dad thought that I should go on to school. My brother Arlo would come back and take over the farm. And I think that was in the back of my dad's mind, that I was going to do what he wanted to do. And then Arlo had a means of continuing with the farm.
According to what I can see on the clock, I've got at least 2 questions out here, and we have 1 minute before we leave. Can we stretch that, Scott?
Looks like it. There doesn't seem to be any class after this. We're booked to 3, but I don't see anybody out there.
Okay, well, we're going to keep going till they kick us out. So we'll go to Mary and then Dick.
Isn't there a program, going back to your question, isn't there a program at the University of Wisconsin and perhaps a couple other places where wildlife students are required to basically take a hunting class and harvest and cook it and eat it? And I think it's like a quarter or semester course, but I'm not positive. I've certainly heard of something like this. I've read about it, and I think it's University of Wisconsin.
So
You're laughing, Randy.
the question is, have you heard of a class either at the University of Wisconsin or some other school that requires wildlife students to take a hunting class, take an animal, and eat it? Have you heard of something like that?
No, it doesn't sound like it would ever occur in a day's college, no.
That's probably the case.
I'm sure I read about it.
We'll have to look into that, Mary.
Stevens.
At Stevens Point, University of Wisconsin. We'll have to check that out.
I went to Stevens Point.
Did you ever hear of it?
No.
No. Dick, what's your question?
You mentioned the prevailing view of predator-prey relations as you're getting into the field, and you're in Berkeley, and you had some questions about the prevailing view that predation was of no consequence. Was there a time or a set of events that you feel sort of broadened the perspective on that issue and possibly raise substantial questions about ignoring predation's potential limit on prey? A time or a place or studies or professional contributions?
Okay, Dick, I'm going to have to ask you to rephrase that into one sentence because I don't think I caught the whole gist of your question.
When did the professional view of the importance of predation change from it's of no consequence to it's potentially consequential?
When did you perceive that the national view of predation doesn't have an effect on a population change to say, oh yeah, maybe it does? When did that happen in your view?
The national view?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure it's changed.
What about an Alaskan view?
What about the,
For some segments it's changed, but some others, it hasn't, I don't think.
I'm thinking of the professional.
well, within the wildlife managers.
Oh, I thought you were talking about public in
Yeah.
general.
It's hopeless.
Within wildlife managers who originally came to Alaska knowing that predation didn't have an effect on the prey population, when did you see that changing and how did it come about?
I think it was changing. It must have been changing fairly substantially in the early 70s. Because I know there were still some biologists that were really questioning it at the first game board meeting that I had, and that was in the early, must have been early 70s sometime. But most of them were changing reluctantly. They really changed reluctantly. It took them a long time. But I think that's when the substantial change was taking place. And all of a sudden, yes, there was a realization that in some of these particularly some of the moose populations, there really was a lack of compensatory mortality.
And what was the impetus for that change of opinion? Why do you think they changed their minds?
I think the data was gradually becoming so inescapable that we had much better grasp on what some of the predator populations were and what some of the prey populations were, and we were getting a real handle on calf mortality and what was causing it. So I think, yes, the data was gradually accumulating and people were realizing that, my gosh, this didn't add up the way it used to. That there was a real effect of predation. But there were some holdout biologists for quite a while, and still are.
I do remember after I started at Fish and Game in '81, Bill Gassaway explaining to me that he always signed up early at board meetings to say there was no need for predator control. He testified to that more than once. So he ended up writing very influential papers. Any other questions? If not, Sam, thank you for sharing your time, your insights. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, I think that's fine. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.